Hi, everyone. Welcome to our back to school event today. We are going to be discussing managing back to school during the COVID-19 pandemic and disability issues as they apply to this new world we are living in. My name is Karin Willison, and I am a senior contributor editor here at the Mighty. I'll be moderating today. I edit articles and work with members of our community from the disability, autism, and parenting spaces. I'm very excited to have our guests today introduce themselves and then we will go on to discussing some questions. If you have questions for our guests, you can post them in the comments and we will try to answer as many as we can. All right, go ahead, Priya, if you'd like to introduce yourself. Priya, you're on mute still.
Good. That was not good.
There you go. You're good now.
Okay. So hi, I'm Priya Lalvani, and I just wanted to start by saying thank you to Karin and to the Mighty for having us on this show and for highlighting this important issue of educating students with disabilities during these times, and particularly focusing on inclusive education during these times. So just a little bit of background about myself. I am a professor at Montclair State University. I teach courses in disability studies and inclusive education. So primarily, I'm a teacher educator. I educate teachers who are learning how to educate students with disabilities inclusively. I'm also a disability studies scholar and researcher and author, but just to give a little bit of context or to explain what that is, disability studies, not to be confused with special education, is a field that really seeks to understand and examine the experience of disability in a socio-political context. So instead of understanding impairments per se, it seeks to understand how impairments interact within environments in which individuals with disabilities are either denied access or provided access, right? So it seeks to really understand how we as a society have constructed the idea of disability, if you will. And the ultimate goal then is to work towards removing barriers to the full participation of individuals with disabilities in society by reducing stigma, increasing understanding, changing attitudes, and ultimately increasing the participation of children with disabilities in schools and individuals in societies. So specifically, my research has been around educational discourses and practices through which children with disabilities become marginalized, and how we can sort of change these, if you will. I'm also really focused on families of children with disabilities and their experiences of navigating the IEP process. So that's a big part of my work, and a lot of my research is around trying to understand how families experience this process, and much of it finds huge discrepancies in families' experiences based on socioeconomic background, access, availability of cultural and economic capital. And so those are my interests and my work. And I should say I'm a New Jersey resident, and yay, go New Jersey. And I'm also a mother. I have 2 kids. I like to say I have one with labeled with a disability and one without. So a little bit of diversity there in the family. My younger child, my daughter, Minal, has Down syndrome and has been fully included in schools since she was 2.5 years old. So I wear a number of different hats coming to this.
That's great. Thank you so much. Lynn, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Karin, for having us on. We're very excited to join the Mighty in this conversation today. My name is Lynn Rubray, and I'm with the National Down Syndrome Society as their Inclusive Education Specialist. I focus on helping families with their IEPs and helping them to navigate the new virtual IEPs that we're having, and work on goals and accommodations and virtual learning. In addition to that, I also manage the National Inclusive Education Task Force, which Dr. Lalvani is on with us. And that's what we do here at the National Down Syndrome Society, helping to support families.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, let's go ahead and start off with a question. If we're going to talk about inclusive education, then we should first discuss what it is. What is inclusive education, and how is it understood by teachers and parents, and what are the misconceptions around it?
So it's a great question, and I think the answer will depend on who you ask, but I guess you're asking us. So there's a lot of different definitions out there. I'm going to approach it from a critical education and a social justice education perspective, which is the understanding that I operate with, and I'll also address some of the misconceptions. So essentially, inclusive education is often misconceived as something that pertains only to students with disabilities. When we talk about inclusive education, we kind of have this at the back of our heads. We're talking about kids with disabilities, right? It's code. But in a broader sense, really, it is that, of course, but it's much broader than that. It's really a practice, a philosophy and a practice of teaching heterogeneous groups together. And by heterogeneous, I mean children from different ethnicities and cultures and linguistic backgrounds and gender identities and socioeconomic backgrounds, abilities and disabilities, educating all those children together, and providing the supports and the accommodations that each of those children will need in order to thrive in a classroom. So what it's not is about putting a child with a disability in a general education classroom, as is often the case or understood to be, all right, inclusive education, so you want the child in a gen ed class, but the child's not going to be able to keep up. If I had a dime for every time I heard that, right? So inclusive education isn't about putting a child physically in a general education classroom. It's really a practice. It's something you do, right? Include is, it's a verb, to include. So it's really about the practices through which we provide access. We provide meaningful entry points for all children. We provide meaningful interactions for forming friendships, relationships, and healthy socio-emotional growth. So it's really about access. And it's also really about education in a democratic society. At its core, I think inclusive education can't be separated from democratic education, right? What does education look like in a democracy? Or rather, a bigger question is, what are we preparing children for? What is education for, if not meaningful participation in a heterogeneous, diverse, democratic society? And so I think that classrooms need to be representative or to reflect the true diversity that exists in the community at large. And when we don't educate children inclusively, instead of talking about whether we should educate children inclusively, I like to say when we don't educate them inclusively, then we are shortchanging all children by not allowing them to experience what the full range of diversity is in the community in which they will be adults working and living.
And when you use models like universal design, you can reach many different students on many different levels in an inclusive environment. So we're not taking away from one segment or one population and giving to another. We're incorporating all of them together. So I think inclusivity means that we have to find ways that we can manage all of these things all together. So if you look at like how we've gone from teaching about different holidays and things like that in schools, it's the same thing. We're not taking away from one thing, we're just adding others, and we're making it so that everyone is is being educated together in an inclusive environment that services all the needs of all the students.
Wonderful. Those are really insightful thoughts. Thank you so much. Let's go ahead and kind of expand this and talk about how has inclusive education worked in traditional times, in traditional schooling prior to the pandemic?
So I think, if I may be so bold as to say, maybe the question could be, how has it worked or not worked, right? So it's a loaded question, right? So we have these laws, we've had them. We've had educational laws, special education laws for decades now that mandate that children with disabilities should be educated to the maximum extent possible alongside their non-disabled peers, and I'm quoting from IDEA law, right? And it also stipulates that removal of a child with a disability from a general education classroom can only occur when it is reasonably believed that a child with a disability cannot be supported, even given all the supports, accommodations, modifications, and supplementary aids and services. Given all of those things, the child would not be able to learn in a general education classroom. Only then can removal be considered, right? And there's that, but in reality, that's not exactly what's happening. So we have nationally, almost half of our children with disabilities in the United States are educated in either partially or fully segregated environments. And when I use the word segregated environments, and I always use the term segregated, I'm talking about self-contained classrooms or schools for children with disabilities, right? And these are based on a number of erroneous justifications. Smaller is better. They need individualized instruction. Of course, they need individualized instruction. That's the whole point of the IEP. But the question is whether that individualized education can be provided inclusively. So in my home state, which is New Jersey, the numbers look a little bit worse than the national numbers, actually a lot worse. New Jersey is very sadly not doing what it should be doing. We are lagging behind in our record on inclusive education, with large numbers of students with disabilities fully segregated and not having any access to their their non-disabled peers. And when you look at children with intellectual disabilities, that number drops drastically to, I want to say generously, under 10%. So when you look at children with intellectual disabilities or multiple disabilities, you're looking at less than 10% of children, even in preschools, that do not have access to general education classrooms, curricula, and their non-disabled peers. And I think that's unconscionable. But that is the reality of where we are right now. And I think we could talk all night about why. But I think it's basically an unquestioned assumption, particularly in New Jersey. And I'm a teacher educator here, so I hear this a lot with people that I work with and with parents that I work with. It's sort of an unquestioned assumption that separate is in the best interest. It just is. This is how we've done it. We've always done it this way. It's just right that a special needs class is the best place for special needs children with a special teacher in a separate place. And it just hasn't changed. In New Jersey, it hasn't changed for the longest time. And then we expect these children in this bifurcated parallel system of education that we have created in the USA, general and special education functioning as parallel systems of education. And then we expect them to graduate and to go out there in a world that is not a self-contained class, and to be meaningful participants in society, and also for non-disabled children who have never actually sat alongside those children all their lives. We throw them out into the world and say, go, produce.
And I think that a large part that we're missing is that all of the research, the empirical research that's done for inclusive education, shows that inclusive education outperforms segregated settings in every model. They show that students do better in academics. They show that, and that's both disabled students and typically developing students. They show that students do better in their social skills and their life skills in an inclusive setting. All of the models show that the inclusive setting is where all students will gain the most from their academic, classes. In addition to that, you have other countries that are not doing segregated settings. They don't have separate settings for students like England does not. That's not their model. They educate their students together. There are a lot of other countries that educate students together. And this is something that we have come to believe in the United States, is that when we slow things down and when we have a special educator in the room, then students will perform better. And all the research shows that that's just not true.
Yeah, and this is, I mean, as someone who went through the public school system, I have physical disability only, but, my parents had to fight for me to be included. And it's just really unfortunate that so little has changed since then. And that especially that kids with intellectual disabilities really still are not being included. It's very disappointing, to hear that. And I mean, I hope we can discuss more about what to do about it. But I think at this point, we should ask the question, how is all of this being affected by the pandemic? What is inclusive education in the pandemic?
That's a great question. What is inclusive education in a pandemic? Obviously what it's going to look like is going to be different, just like what education is going to look like is going to be different in a pandemic. I'll just start by saying that the need for inclusive education hasn't changed or should not change. And I say this for a reason, is because I've been hearing from a lot of parents, and I do a lot of parent workshops, and I work with a lot of parents, which is why I'm bringing that up, and educators and administrators. I hear this troubling comment based on a misconception, I think, and it's something to the effect that, well, inclusive education, all well and good, Priya, but now we're all home. Nobody is, it's not relevant anymore because nobody's in the gen ed classroom. We're not there. Everyone's working at home. Everyone really is remote learning. And so I don't know why we're having this conversation about inclusive education when nobody is really even there, right? Well, that's actually a really problematic idea, and only works if you originally thought that inclusive education is a place, is a brick and mortar place, right? If you thought that inclusive education meant that your child or a child is physically allowed to be in a general education physical space, then yeah, the argument holds that, well, no one's in that space right now, so let's stop having this conversation. But if you understood inclusive education not to be a place, but a practice, right? A practice of providing access, a practice of providing accommodations, a practice of giving children with disabilities the opportunities to participate in all aspects of school life and learning, then it really doesn't hold that it's not relevant anymore. In fact, I would argue that it's more relevant than ever in these times. Never has there been a greater urgency to talk about inclusivity than now in the pandemic times, when we are a lot of us floundering. Teachers are, to their credit, just, they are really trying their best to make this work. So the question of how inclusion can work in these times has never really been more relevant. And so it's going to look different, obviously. Many schools are talking about, schools have been doing co-teaching models. Many schools have been doing models of collaborative teaching and co-teaching already, right, prior to the pandemic. It's going to look different now, where many districts are doing models where a general education teacher alongside a support teacher is able to provide the lesson, where accommodations are created for children with disabilities. The content is modified such that a child with a disability can have an access point, an entry point to learning. There are so many ways that technology can be used. And I know that that's tricky as well, certainly when we talk about technology and which people have access, and making sure that all children have access to the technologies, again, becomes also very tricky. It's not just about providing the Chromebooks, which many districts are doing. It's great, providing Chromebooks, providing iPads to those that don't have access to it. But it's beyond that. What it's going to look like is helping children to understand and families to understand how those will be used, how the lessons can be used, doing a lot of trainings, providing notes, summaries, organizers in ways that children can access it, using text-to-speech apps, using recorded lessons, and using instructions that are not in text but recorded instructions, and a host of other things that are going to come into play. And I think teachers, hats off to teachers that have, really, I can't say enough for what teachers have been doing to float this boat, really, right? But teachers need access to learning more about how virtual learning can be done for kids with disabilities. They need more PD on that. They need the tools. And I think that districts have to provide teachers with the tools to be able to do these things. And I'll just make a quick pitch for Montclair State University, which just recently began a very quick crash course, if you will, a 6-credit certificate program in virtual teaching for teachers of students with disabilities. So I know a number of universities are doing things like that. But teachers need help too. Teachers need really to have the tools at their fingertips to be able to reach the kids that they're going to be teaching.
So I think they also, as we've said before, the role and the model of inclusion doesn't stop because of COVID. So one of the things that we need to think about is, and for teachers, they can brainstorm about ways when we talk about universal design that help all students. So when teachers can provide the classrooms where they can give students information and materials before class begins is helpful. When they can record sessions, it's helpful. And these are things, again, going back to that universal design, that helps everyone in the classroom. There are other students besides students with disabilities that want to rewatch their class, that want to, maybe read some material beforehand. These are all things that are beneficial for all the students and will help students to maintain and grasp the material. And when we start thinking of technology that we can use, like text-to-talk, and typing assistant tools and materials like that, and Dropbox and Google Drives that we share, and classroom links that we share, these are ways that we can still have inclusion in a virtual classroom with other students and with the teacher, that will include all the students together.
Wonderful, great questions. So I think at this point, let's go ahead and talk about IEPs. I think that because that's kind of the next step here, how do teachers and how do parents approach IEPs in a virtual setting to address these needs for these kids that need inclusive education?
So some things are going to be a little bit challenging, like doing physical therapy from a virtual world is very difficult, doing speech therapy, doing some of these services. There are other things that we can do and put into IEPs that would assist students. Academic support outside of the class time of a virtual class is very helpful. We've also been telling families, for those that have the ability to go through their private insurance, should they have that, those are also options that you can do for your therapies, and even potentially evaluations that you have done with your speech therapist or your OT or your PT that's outside the classroom setting. But IEP teams really have to brainstorm together to try to do that. We're already doing things virtually, so now we're continuing those brainstorming sessions of what are the accommodations that we could do for this student. We have a lot of resources on the NDSS website under our COVID page. There are academic resources for things like virtual schedules and things that students can use to help set themselves up in a virtual learning environment that can help them have some academic success. If anyone wants to visit the NDSS webpage, it's right on our front page. The COVID link there will take you into a variety of different resources that are available, including academic educational resources.
And I would add to that, what would I say to a parent in preparing for your IEP? Know your rights. Know your rights. Be prepared. Know that a child's IEP still needs to be carried out in these times. Know that services do need to be provided, and learn as much as you can about the vast range of accommodations and supports that can be provided remotely. So arming yourself with that knowledge or learning as much as you can prior to an IEP meeting is great. I think that parents are in a really tricky role right now. And all parents, right, are finding themselves in the unprecedented situation where they are suddenly, all parents, not just parents of kids with disabilities, but are finding themselves in this unique role right now where they are supporting their children's education to such an extent, more than before. For parents of kids with disabilities, this is magnified a great deal. Many parents of kids with disabilities find that they are spending all day supporting their child's learning. So I think that these are issues and questions to be had at the IEP meeting, right? To what extent am I expected? And I have to say, all my work with parents, I mentioned earlier that I find a huge discrepancy, right? In parents' experiences of navigating IEPs and the services they receive. But I think in these times, we have to ask ourselves, what are we expecting of parents, of kids with disabilities particularly? And more relevant question is, which parents will be equipped to provide those kinds of supports? If we're expecting, I am a parent who supports my child, right, at home. Now we're finding that we are providing speech support and physical support, and we're the therapists and we're the teachers and we're all these things. But the question to ask is, can we expect parents to do this? Because if that's the case, then which parents, the parents with the greatest levels of privilege and the greatest amounts of capital and work schedules that allow them to be able to do this, those who are working from home or have that kind of flexibility, those who have access to, signing their child up to this class and that class or that tutor or that resource, or what it's going to do, and this was already the case, this is not new, but this will exacerbate it, is that it will just widen the inequities for outcomes for students with disabilities. If we expect that parents, and any parents will, of course, I would expect that parents will support their children, but we can't. What I'm saying is that this conversation needs to be had at an IEP, right? Because if I, as a parent, I'm saying hypothetically, is expected to provide that level of support, then we are talking about increasing an inequity and a divide between parents of privilege and those who don't have that same level of privilege. So we, as educators, I'm speaking as an educator, we really need to think hard about the levels of support and access that's being provided to that child, so that to an extent that child is able to access that work.
Absolutely. And I think to approach without judgment, because I think you have to believe that every parent who's going through this IEP process wants the best for their child, but their own personal situation is going to affect how much they can do. I definitely was had the parent who stayed home and did a lot of stuff for me, but not everybody can do that. And that doesn't mean they don't love their child or want to do everything possible to help their child. Their resource situation is different, and so, yeah, we have to talk about this and make sure that each child is getting their needs met. And on that note, I think it's important to talk about some of the potential challenges and accessibility barriers of virtual education. We had a comment come in. Someone was saying that her child struggles with the virtual education with the iPad. She can only focus on it for 5-10 minutes at a time. And how do you address those kinds of issues of kids with short attention spans or who just struggle to engage with a screen or with a person on a screen? And so I guess, can we talk about that and other accessibility challenges that you are seeing with virtual education and how we can address those?
So I think that's a great question. I think providing large chunks of material, providing big pieces of content might not be the best. And I think let's talk about the phrase individualized education plan, right? When we create accommodated or modified content, but it's a one-size-fits-all modified piece or a one-size-fits-all accommodation, that may not work as this person is asking for certain children. So I think we're going to have to look at each kid, each child, and what is going to work for them. And if it means 5-minute chunks or 5-minute pieces at various intervals, that may be the way to go. But to the broader question of challenges, I think that we are more comfortable or more familiar with the idea of creating accommodations for children with disabilities. But when it comes to creating modified content, that becomes a little more tricky. Some children will need a lesson modified for them. Let's say, rewriting Act 1, Scene 2 of Romeo and Juliet in summary form or in audio form. So, in other words, what I'm saying is that we can't expect that an accommodation made for one child with a disability is going to work for another child with a disability. We're going to have to look at each child and create those individualized lessons for each of them.
The other thing we're going to have to look at is how students, because states vary with the accommodation plans and the modifications that they allow to students' educations. So in some states, they do not allow for students to have modifications done to their work without changing their graduation track for school. So this is something that's going to have to be addressed so that we can provide appropriate virtual education for students with disabilities.
And to bring up, Lynn had earlier talked about UDL. I think that bears mentioning again here. So UDL, Universal Design for Learning, is something that we all need to bear in mind at this point. And it's the idea that instead of creating a lesson for a classroom, let's say, and then creating an accommodation for a child that needs it. That's a more traditional sort of approach. Universal design for learning sort of flips the idea, and it approaches the lesson with the idea that why don't we just create the lesson upfront with as many possible entry points, with as many possible options for learning the content or for demonstrating what you have learned. So if we approach learning in that way, where teachers start to create their lesson, not creating the lesson and then creating the accommodation, create a lesson that takes into account any number of possibilities of supports that may be needed, and allowing a number of different modalities for children, and a number of different, whether it's a 5-minute piece or so different ways of children even demonstrating what they have learned, whether it's through a video, whether it's text, whether it's writing it, whether it's speaking it, and so forth.
Great. And we had someone from the community ask, I'm just going to read their question because it'll make the most sense that way. Do we work with the IEP team to revise IEPs so they meet the child's needs now during the pandemic? Or should we stay with the same IEP and make special notes due to the current situation? Here are the changes. In other words, yeah, there's the question. What do you guys think about that?
So if you have concerns about your IEP and how it's going to be addressed with your school, because we have a variety of different schools all across the country, there is not one solution for every student. And we've already talked about how IEP is an individualized plan. So there are many different schools doing a variety of different things. Some schools are returning from remote learning and they're doing in-person sessions. Some schools are only doing remote learning, depending on whether or not there are hotspots of a pandemic right now. And you also have states like New Jersey that is doing either or. Parents can request to have remote learning. So there's a variety of different things to keep up on with what your school's reopening plan looks like. But if you have concerns or questions about how your student is going to do it, or other families are talking about whether or not they want their student to return, these are all things that you have to bring back to your IEP team to say that you want to have an IEP meeting and to discuss those returns. You absolutely can change your IEP to reflect some of the goals and the objectives of the IEP so that they can be better met virtually. You can also gain support for these things, like your school will talk about documentation needed if you're deciding that you want your student to learn remotely instead of going into the school setting. The school will work with you to discuss what they need from you in order to make that happen. So these are conversations that you should start having with your school if you haven't done that already. Dr. Lalvani, I'm sure you have a couple comments to say on this.
Yeah, no, I think that you're right on, Lynn. I think that a conversation with the IEP team is absolutely essential at the beginning of the school year at these times. So I think every family should reach out to their case manager, their IEP team, and try to figure out how some of the nitty-gritty of this is going to work, right? Because it's not enough that it's a goal or a service on the IEP, but in these times, it needs to be discussed. Who is going to be providing that, where, how, what levels of support will be needed at home, and whether I can provide that support.
Great. And the next question is, what can parents and teachers do in cases where children, because of their disabilities, are going to in-person school, but they have difficulties with safety protocols? They have sensory issues that make it hard for them to wear a mask or wash their hands often enough, or they don't understand, new rules about staying a certain distance from people and not touching certain people and surfaces and things like that. How can those issues be addressed, both in terms of safety and in terms of working with kids on these issues?
So we're hearing a lot about this. We're hearing from families that are saying, my child just cannot wear a mask. My child doesn't understand the social distancing. And what we're recommending is that families start that now at home. We've talked with families. There's a whole bunch of, if you just Google, wearing a mask, you will come up with lots of tips from specifically from specialists like psychologists on some different ways that you can get that mask acclimation, because during this pandemic, it doesn't matter whether you're returning to school virtually or whether you're going to be learning from home, you still should be working on trying to wear a mask, because if that student has to go to the doctor, if that student has to leave the home for any reason, they should have these skills. And these are also conversations that we need to be having with students with disabilities on how to maintain their safety. So there are a variety of different tools that you can look up. There's YouTube videos. I watched one the other day that was like 15 minutes long, that was talking about the different things we can do to help children learn how to wear masks. We can do things of wearing them at home. We can do them at certain time intervals. We can do them with rewards, similar ways that you get your academic goals through to your students. You want to work on those things, whether it's hand washing. Lots of websites are recommending like singing a song during hand washing to make sure that it's done for a certain amount of time. And just that conversation really needs to be happening with your student all the time regarding, the measures that they need to take if they're going to be returning to school. And these are things that you can practice at home. These are things you can practice with family members. Again, there's a wide variety of videos that are out there that can show you, about sitting appropriately distance away, and hey, let's wave instead of hugging or high fiving our friends, and different things. But these are things that we should be going over before returning to school, because students will be overwhelmed if they go back to school and they haven't been having these conversations at home, and the practice is already at home in a safe and warm environment with their family members.
And I know that a number of schools are also assisting families with that. So I think that is just awesome, where they are working with families, providing them the resources to help them to teach their children these safe practices. And I think it's really, really important for schools and families to collaborate together, to look at the resources, as Lynn mentioned, because that's the first step. And the resources are there, the professionals are there. Families can have a conversation with their caseworkers about how they can access some help to help their child, to support their child with some of these things.
Great. And what can parents do if their district has gone back to in-person schooling, but they don't feel that's safe for their child? Maybe their child really is struggling to wear a mask, or they are immune suppressed, they're extremely high risk, and they're not, convinced that the school safety protocols are adequate. What options do parents have in that situation? Can they insist on virtual education if the rest of the district is going back to in-person school, or what can they do?
The first thing you want to do is you want to speak to your healthcare provider. Your child's specialist and pediatrician are the best resources for you right now to go to. If you're struggling with an immune-compromised student, such as I am myself, I have 2 daughters who have Down syndrome, and one has already been on a ventilator prior to the pandemic arriving in the United States. So these are conversations that you're going to want to have with your pediatrician and or your other child specialist, like a pulmonologist or the other specialists that they see, so that you can talk with them to discuss the safety of your student returning to school, and discuss your concerns. There are schools that are, I know in the state of New Jersey, a doctor's note is warranted to request for virtual learning instead of returning to school. There are also schools doing many different things to try to ensure student safety, as in setting up different places for students that are immunocompromised, and doing other things for students that may need more support to return to school. So these are things that you want to talk to your healthcare worker about and your school about, again, to try to come to conclusions on what would be the best fit for your student.
Great, thank you. That was extremely helpful. And okay, so we're getting towards the end of our chat. If we have anybody in the community who has a question that they haven't asked in chat yet, if you could go ahead and do that. And I'm going to see what else we have. Do you all have other thoughts that you would like to share while we're waiting for any questions to come in? Something that any of this brought up for you or you want to discuss?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking, on this issue of parents and navigating IEPs and inclusive education in the pandemic. Families, parents, and particularly mothers, because mothers have borne the burden mostly of advocacy. Families have always been at the forefront of seeking access for their children with disabilities, of advocating for inclusive education. That has always been the case, and it is still the case today. There's a wide breadth of research that shows that inclusive education is linked with parent advocacy. And that means that the vast majority of children, particularly those with intellectual disabilities or multiple disabilities, significant needs for support, if they are being educated inclusively, chances are that there is a parent who had to, quote unquote, fight, as they would say, for it. What is wrong with that sentence? Everything. For one, when parents, like I mentioned this before, when parents are advocating for access and inclusion, we, and I put myself in that category, we are going to feed into an inequity in the system. In other words, the children of those parents who are able to advocate for inclusive education are more likely to be in inclusive education, leaving children who are already vulnerable more vulnerable. And so it's very, very problematic to expect advocacy on the part of parents. But even bigger problem with that is, why is anyone needing to advocate for inclusive education? Inclusive education isn't something that anyone should need to seek, should not need to fight for, should not need to advocate for. That a child is a member of their natural community of peers, and that a child belongs in the school community should be a given. It shouldn't require justification. It shouldn't require a fight. The question should never be, are we going to include this child, or can this child be included? The question should only be, how are we going to provide the supports that this child needs in order to thrive in their natural environment? So I think that's something that we really need to think about as families, as educators, as a community, as a society, because inclusive education is a fundamental civil right. It's an issue of democratic education, and it's about what kind of world we want for our children.
I would also add to Priya's comments that parents need to collaborate with their schools, with their IEP teams. Do not, do not sit back and try to do this yourself. Do not sit back and, try to figure out how it's all going to go. To really reach out to those schools and to really reach out to your IEP team and to really work on how are we going to make this happen. And you can have additional meetings. You can call meetings at the school. You can say, this isn't working for my child. What else can we do? So to keep on that, and if you need additional resources, pull from them. So many states have different associations that will come and help you advocate, different things that you can, ask people to join in your IEP meetings and join your collaborative efforts to help provide that for you. But parents really need to keep going back to the school and saying, how are we going to do this? How is this going to get done? What can we do to make sure that my student is gaining access that they're entitled to by IDEA?
Absolutely. And we have commenters saying this is not a new problem. This has always existed. And that's absolutely true. And I think it's unfortunate. My mother always used to say that, she was fighting because hopefully that would make it easier for other parents in the future, that they wouldn't have to fight. But it seems like even though that was 30 years ago, not a lot has changed. And so we need a new way. We need it to be accepted that inclusive education is the norm and it's a given, and that parents should not have to fight for it. It should be provided, and the process should be collaborative instead of adversarial. So does anyone have any final thoughts they would like to share just in general before we end our chat today?
We want to thank, go ahead, Priya.
No, I said those were my final thoughts.
We want to thank the Mighty for having us on. And again, this conversation is being had around the nation right now. We invite parents to reach out to, again, their local organizations for additional support, the NDSS for support. Families are always welcome to, and more importantly, their child study team for support. Families are always welcome to seek support from the NDSS.
Wonderful. And thank you both so much.
I wanted to say thank you to the Mighty, really, this is such an important conversation, and to be able to have it here, and we're grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for both of your insights today. I learned a lot. I hope our community did as well. And I hope you all will check out the resources that were put in the chat, and feel free to ask questions in the chat later, and I'll try to go through and answer any that I can. Thank you so much, everybody, and I hope you have a good evening. Goodbye.